Hi Rompereglas, my name is Isabela and I just want to talk to you today about healing generational trauma and how to not take the healing process so personally. Before I get started talking about ancestral trauma, I want you to know that there is a Facebook group in which these conversations are taking place and where the healing is taking place, and it's called Liberated Latinx Women Lead the World. The link is below in the notes, and click on that and join our group to continue this conversation. Let's start with a question. Have you ever had the experience of recurring thoughts, feelings, or even bodily sensations that you can't tie back to an actual lived experience? If so, you may be experiencing what I call an ancestral echo, which is thoughts, feelings, and sensations related to somebody else's trauma in your family that you've absorbed in your energy body. And I say that, I ask this question because a lot of us experience this. We don't know where it's coming from. We think it's us. And so I just want to talk about 4 ways that we can absorb generational or ancestral trauma. Before I go into the 4 ways we absorb ancestral trauma, I really just want to say that all ancestral trauma is, and how it gets transmitted, is through survival patterns. And survival patterns are obviously there to keep you safe, but they restrict your range of freedom. And that's really important because what we're doing here is liberation work. So we absorb survival patterns in 4 ways. So they're not in order of importance, but I'll just go through each one and you decide which resonates the most with you. I mean, they're all of them, but some will resonate more than others. So the first one is through mirroring. So as babies, we are energy bodies. We're just learning. We are wired for connection, and we're learning how to connect with our caregivers, how to survive, because we're completely helpless and dependent. So we're gazing up into the face of our caregiver, and they reflect our reality back at us. So if they're frowning, if they're depressed, if they're grieving some loss that's happened around the time you were born or before, we're going to mirror that back. Our facial expressions will match that of our caregiver. And that process happens through the vagus nerve, which is basically a social survival system that is wired through our whole body. So our whole bodies absorb the depression or the sadness or the grief that is happening in this interaction with your caregiver. So the second way that we absorb survival patterns is through learned experiences. And this is the way that most of us understand trauma. But I want to talk about I want to move beyond shock trauma, obvious abuse situations, and talk about more subtle ways that survival patterns can be transmitted. And I'm going to use an example to illustrate this. So let's say that your father was beaten repeatedly as a child. Maybe he had a parent who was mentally ill. And so this father will now is traumatized and has PTSD, and it might show up as hypervigilance and fear that their child, you, will be harmed in some way, the way that he was. Not by him necessarily, but maybe by something else in the environment. And so he may be overprotective of you, really careful, and treat you as fragile, and maybe fear you getting kidnapped or something else terrible happening to you. And so this overprotectiveness is very different from what he experienced, but it may also be a way of transmitting the trauma. So these learned experiences also restrict our range. You may be growing up in this way. You may fear something bad's going to happen, and you don't know what that is. You just learn to fear the world. The third way that we can absorb survival patterns is through our DNA, through a process called epigenetics. And this is really a way that not only we can absorb survival patterns, but it's really a resiliency process. We're really ensuring the survival of the next generation by teaching them what behaviors, how we've adapted to certain conditions, and how we can ensure the survival of the next generation. The problem is that, in this generation, we are not experiencing the same form of colonialism. We're not experiencing the same form of patriarchy. We have a lot more freedom than we did before, relatively speaking, and yet we still find ourselves with that restriction of range, the restriction of freedom. Finally, the fourth way that generational trauma or survival patterns are transmitted is through energy. And again, wanting to take you back to a newborn baby who doesn't have the capacity to think, doesn't have language, is completely dependent, doesn't have an ego to defend itself and to filter out things from the environment. It is just absorbing everything. So I want you to consider for a moment the traces that are left when horrific events happen. Again, colonialism, slavery, internment camps, things of that nature that are in the air. So this is the collective consciousness. And babies are able to absorb the collective consciousness. We all absorb the collective consciousness, whether we're babies or adults, but in our adult bodies, because of our egos and our defenses, we are able to filter out some of that information. Babies are not. So as soon as we're born into these templates where all of this information is lingering, and that can be really overwhelming for a small organism. So we're absorbing this energetically, and we can sort of adjust our energy to match the energy of the fragmentation of the environment. So this is the way that we absorb these traces of what's left over from historical events, historical trauma, into our bodies. So I want to say 2 or 3 things after sharing this information with you. The first thing is that you are a living record of history, of your ancestors' experiences. And I hope that knowing this empowers you and gives you a sense of responsibility that is positive in terms of moving forward in your healing process. So what I mean to say by that is that when you're doing something for yourself, when you are practicing meditation, when you are doing the healing work, that it isn't just about you. You are giving gifts constantly. Like every time you engage in a movement practice, you are offering a gift to your ancestors, and te están aplaudiendo. They're clapping for you. They're excited that you're doing the work because they didn't have the opportunity to do it. They were working in the fields. They were experiencing abuses. There was no room for that. And you and I have resources at our fingertips, including videos like these that they never had. So I say that to empower you, that you're not doing it just for you, and you're not doing it just for them. You are doing it for the generations to come. The healing of trauma is a way to find yourself again, to return to your core self, your essential self, your authentic self, right? And in your authentic self, that is where you have freedom. That is where liberation lives. That is where you find your power and your resilience that you can then offer to other people and really enjoy for yourself and do amazing things with. Thank you so much for watching until the end. Leave comments below if you found this helpful. Ask questions about what you want more of, and I will offer that to you. Click on the subscribe button. Join our community of liberated Latinx women lead the world. There is so much for you here, and I hope that you keep watching.